An orphan donated toys to the hospital. This simple act of kindness, scribbled in hasty blue ink on a community bulletin board, caught Mason Reeves's eye as he hurried past. The CEO of Memorial Children's Hospital paused, his breath creating small clouds in the December air, as something tugged at the weathered corners of his heart. Mason hadn't planned to stop at the community center that evening. His Italian leather shoes weren't made for the slush-covered sidewalks, and the board meeting had run late again. But something, perhaps the same invisible hand that had guided him through the darkest chapters of his life, made him take the detour past his old neighborhood. Donations accepted through Friday. The flyer continued in smaller text. A crude drawing of a teddy bear adorned the corner, clearly made by a child's uncertain hand. Mason traced the drawing with his fingertip, feeling the indentations in the paper. 25 years melted away in an instant. "Sir, we're closing soon." The janitor's voice startled Mason back to the present. He nodded, straightening his cashmere coat. "Who's organizing this toy drive?" he asked, his voice carrying a hint of his earlier years, before elocution lessons and business school had polished away the rough edges. "Oh, that'd be the kids from Hillcrest," the janitor replied, leaning on his mop. "The orphanage sends a few of them over each year to run it. Got one boy who's really taken charge this time. Bit of a miracle considering his situation." Mason's heart quickened. "Hillcrest is still operating? Going on 50 years now. Not that the state gives them enough to keep the heat working properly." The janitor shrugged. "You donating?" Mason didn't answer. His mind was already racing ahead, calculations and possibilities spinning like the snowflakes now falling outside the smudged windows. 11-year-old Elijah Parker sat cross-legged on his thin mattress, counting the donations for the third time. The other boys in the dormitory had long since fallen asleep, their soft snores creating a familiar nighttime symphony. Only the yellow glow from his contraband flashlight illuminated the notepad where he meticulously tracked every item. 23 toys. After 3 weeks of planning, posting flyers all over town, and daily trips to the community center collection box, they had 23 toys to donate to the children's hospital. Elijah's throat tightened. It wasn't enough. Not nearly enough for all the kids who would spend Christmas in hospital beds instead of around trees. Kids like his little sister had been before pneumonia took her last winter, leaving him truly alone in the world. He closed his eyes, remembering how Sophie's face would light up whenever a hospital volunteer would bring around a toy cart. How for just a few minutes, the pain and fear would retreat from her eyes. After she died, he had promised himself he would create that feeling for other children. But 23 toys wouldn't create much of anything. Elijah tucked the list under his pillow and switched off the flashlight as Ms. Beatrice's familiar footsteps squeaked down the hallway during her nightly check. He pulled his thin blanket up to his chin, trying to ignore the draft from the poorly insulated windows. Tomorrow was the last collection day. A miracle would have to happen overnight. The morning dawned gray and heavy with unspent snow. Elijah shivered as he slid his feet into worn sneakers, his breath visible in the chilly dormitory air. The radiator had stopped working again sometime during the night. "Eli, you're crazy," whispered Darnell from the next bed. At 9, he was the youngest in their room. "It's Saturday. Go back to sleep." "Can't," Elijah replied, tying his laces with fingers stiff from cold. "Last day for the toy drive. I have to check the collection box." "It'll still be there after breakfast," Darnell mumbled, burrowing deeper under his blankets. But Elijah couldn't wait. The community center opened at 8, and he needed to be there when it did. He had to know if his last hope, the extra flyers he'd put up at the upscale coffee shop where rich people went, had worked. He slipped past Ms. Beatrice, who was dozing at her desk, and out into the biting December air. The 3-block walk to the community center seemed longer in the cold, but the burning in his lungs kept his mind off the gnawing in his stomach. Breakfast would have to wait. When the community center came into view, Elijah stopped, blinking hard. A moving truck idled outside the entrance, its exhaust creating a fog around 2 men unloading large boxes onto dollies. His heart sank. Some other event must be happening today. They probably moved his collection box to make space. Maybe they'd even thrown away the toys, not realizing their importance. Elijah broke into a run, his worn sneakers slipping on patches of ice. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice thin in the winter air. "There's a donation box inside for the hospital toy drive." One of the men turned, a cigarette dangling from his lips. "You Elijah?" Elijah stopped, wary. "Yes?" The man consulted a clipboard. "Perfect timing, kid. Where do you want all this?" "All ... What?" The man gestured to the truck with his clipboard. "The delivery. Someone bought out the entire toy department at Glenwood Mall. The paperwork says it's for your hospital drive. Elijah's mouth fell open. There must be a mistake. No mistake, said the second worker, wheeling a dolly stacked with boxes toward him. We've got the invoice right here. Paid in full. Where do you want them? Inside, the community center director looked as stunned as Elijah felt. They cleared the basketball court, and box after box filled the space. Dolls, action figures, board games, stuffed animals, art supplies, electronic games. Hundreds of toys, each new and gleaming in their packaging. Tucked in the last box was a cream-colored envelope with Elijah's name written in elegant script. With trembling fingers, he opened it. The note inside was brief, for the children at Memorial. Your compassion honors your sister's memory. A friend who understands loss. Elijah read it twice, then a third time. He hadn't told anyone about Sophie, not even Miss. Beatrice knew the full story. Who could have known? And who would spend what must have been thousands of dollars on toys for his small drive? From his parked Audi across the street, Mason watched the boy's face transform with disbelief and wonder as the trucks unloaded their bounty. Something in the child's determined stance, in the way he'd run toward the trucks with no thought for the ice beneath his threadbare sneakers, struck a chord deep within Mason's chest. He had spent half the night making calls, pulling strings to arrange the toy purchase and delivery. His assistant had thought him mad, but had followed his instructions without question, accustomed to his occasional eccentricities. What his assistant didn't know, what no one in Mason's carefully constructed world knew, was that 30 years ago, Mason had been that boy. Different name, different orphanage across town, but the same determined set to the jaw, the same desperate need to matter in a world that had discarded him. Mason's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He had intended only to make an anonymous donation, see the toys delivered, then return to his life of board meetings and budget reviews. But something about this particular boy had pierced the armor he'd spent decades forging. Perhaps it was time to do more than write checks from a distance. The following Tuesday, Elijah and 5 other children from Hillcrest stood in the gleaming lobby of Memorial Children's Hospital, surrounded by carts piled high with wrapped gifts. Miss Beatrice had enlisted volunteers to help transport the unexpected bounty, and the local newspaper had even sent a photographer to document the occasion. Elijah shifted uncomfortably under the bright lights and attention. This wasn't about him, it was about the kids who would receive these gifts, about keeping his promise to Sophie. The children and staff of Memorial thank you for this extraordinary donation, said the hospital's public relations director, a woman with a professional smile and a voice that carried across the marble lobby. Your generosity will brighten the holidays for hundreds of our patients. Cameras flashed as Elijah and the other Hillcrest kids posed beside the mountain of gifts. He tried to smile naturally, but his face felt stiff. This moment should have been perfect, the culmination of all his planning and work, but something felt unfinished. As the other children began following hospital volunteers who would help them distribute the gifts, Elijah hung back, his eyes drawn to a corridor where a tall man in an expensive suit stood watching. There was something familiar about him, though Elijah was certain they'd never met. Their eyes connected across the bustling lobby. The man didn't smile or nod, but something in his gaze held Elijah rooted to the spot. "Elijah, come on!" called Darnell, already halfway to the elevators with a cart of gifts. The moment broke. When Elijah looked back, the man was gone. Mason retreated to his office, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hadn't meant to be seen, hadn't planned to make eye contact with the boy, but something had drawn him out of the safety of the executive suite to witness the donation in person. He sank into his leather chair, loosening his tie with unsteady fingers. The boy's eyes, intelligent, searching, and carrying a weight no child should bear, had struck him like a physical blow. His computer screen showed the live security feed from the lobby. He watched as the children began wheeling carts of toys toward the elevators, headed for the patient floors. The boy Elijah, according to the information Mason had quietly obtained, moved with purpose, checking items off a list as they went. So organized, so determined, so familiar. Mason swiveled away from the screen, facing the wall of windows that overlooked the city. 30 years ago, he had been a forgotten child in a system too overloaded to care properly for the wounded souls in its charge. Now he ran a hospital dedicated to healing children. Yet he had always kept his distance from the actual patients, preferring the safety of budgets and board meetings to the messiness of human connection. His intercom buzzed, startling him from his thoughts. "Mr. Reeves? Doctor, Patel is waiting for your 11 o'clock. Mason cleared his throat. Tell him I'll be there shortly. He stood straightening his tie and made a decision that would change not only his life, but the life of a boy who reminded him too much of himself. So the pediatric oncology ward was simultaneously the hardest and most rewarding stop on their gift distribution route. Elijah steeled himself as they entered, memories of Sophie threatening to overwhelm him. She hadn't been at this hospital. Their small-town medical center hadn't been equipped for her complicated case, but the antiseptic smell and soft beeping of machines were hauntingly familiar. You okay, miss? Beatrice asked softly, her hand warm on his shoulder. Elijah nodded, not trusting his voice. They began moving from room to room, offering each child their choice from the cart. Every smile, every whispered thank you, every parent's tearful glance made the weight in Elijah's chest both heavier and somehow lighter. In the last room, a girl about Sophie's age sat propped against pillows, a colorful scarf wrapped around her head. An IV stand loomed beside her bed like a metal sentry. Hi there, Elijah said, wheeling the cart closer. I'm Elijah. Would you like to pick out a toy? The girl regarded him warily. Are you a volunteer? Sort of. I organized a toy drive. Her eyes widened slightly. You did? By yourself. I had help, Elijah admitted, thinking of the mysterious benefactor who had multiplied his modest collection into this abundance. What's your name? Lily. She peered at the cart. Are these really for us to keep? Absolutely. Whatever you want. Lily's fingers hovered over the toys, finally settling on a plush fox with unusually soft fur. She hugged it to her chest, a small smile transforming her pale face. He feels warm, like sunshine. Something about her words, about the simple joy radiating from her, cracked open a door inside Elijah that had been sealed shut since Sophie's death. He blinked rapidly, fighting the sudden burning in his eyes. I had a sister who was sick too, he found himself saying. She loved stuffed animals. Lily stroked the fox's ears. No. Where is she now? She died last winter, Elijah said, the words still rough in his throat. That's why I wanted to do this. She always said the best days in the hospital were when she got a new toy. Lily studied him with eyes too wise for her years. I bet she'd be really proud of you. Before Elijah could respond, a movement at the doorway caught his attention. The tall man from the lobby stood there, his expression unreadable. This time, instead of disappearing, he stepped into the room. Mr. Reeves, the nurse acknowledged with surprise. We don't often see you on the floors. I wanted to see the toy distribution firsthand. The man replied, his voice deeper than Elijah had expected. The hospital is grateful for such generosity. There was something in the way he said it, not looking at Ms. Beatrice or the nurse, but directly at Elijah, that made the hairs on the back of Elijah's neck stand up. This wasn't just any hospital administrator. You're the friend, Elijah said softly, realization dawning. The one who sent the toys. For a moment, Mason Reeves looked startled, as if unused to being identified so quickly. Then his expression softened almost imperceptibly. I believe in supporting worthwhile initiatives, he said. Your drive showed remarkable vision. The adults in the room exchanged glances, but Elijah held the man's gaze. There was more to this story. He could feel it like a current running between them. Thank you, he said simply. But why? Before Mason could answer, an urgent page summoned him away. He nodded once to Elijah, a gesture that somehow carried the weight of a promise, and disappeared down the corridor. Mason avoided the pediatric floors for the next week. The unexpected confrontation with Elijah had shaken him more than he cared to admit. The boy was too perceptive, too quick to make connections, too much like Mason himself had been. He buried himself in end-of-year reports and budget forecasts, ignoring the nagging feeling that he was running from something important. Each night, he drove home to his empty penthouse overlooking the city lights, poured himself 2 fingers of scotch, and told himself he had done enough. The toys had been donated. The children were happy. His debt, to whom or what he couldn't quite articulate, was paid. But on Christmas Eve, as a light snow dusted the city and the hospital corridors echoed with carols from the volunteer choir, Mason found himself drawn back to the pediatric oncology ward. He told himself he was simply doing his duty as CEO, checking in on patients who couldn't go home for the holidays. But his feet carried him to Lily's room, where he had last seen Elijah. The room was empty, the bed stripped. Mason's stomach dropped. In his years of administrative work, he had learned to recognize what an empty room at Christmas might mean. She went home yesterday, came a voice behind him. Mason turned to find Elijah standing in the doorway, a backpack slung over one shoulder and a tin of cookies in his hands. Her last scan was clear. The boy continued. They're letting her spend Christmas at home. I was just bringing these to the nurses who took care of her, but they told me she left. Relief washed over Mason. That's wonderful news. Elijah nodded, studying Mason with that unnervingly direct gaze. You're the hospital CEO. It wasn't a question. Mason inclined his head slightly. And you grew up at an orphanage. Elijah continued, his voice quiet but sure. That's why you helped with the toy drive. Mason's carefully constructed composure faltered. What makes you say that? Elijah shrugged. The note you sent mentioned understanding loss. And you knew about my sister when nobody else did. The only way you could know is if you checked into my background. And the only reason you'd do that is if you felt connected somehow. He paused. Plus, Ms. Beatrice said you grew up in the system. She recognized your name from some charity thing years ago. A laugh escaped Mason, surprising them both. You'd make a good detective. I'm just good at figuring people out, Elijah said. You have to be in my situation. The simple truth of that statement sobered Mason. He glanced around, ensuring they were alone in the hallway. Lakeside Boys Home, 1985 to 1993, he said quietly. Not Hillcrest, but similar enough. And yes, that's why I helped. But I'd appreciate if you kept that information between us. Why? Seems like something to be proud of. Going from orphan to hospital CEO. It's complicated. Mason ran a hand through his silver-streaked hair. Some stories are better left untold. Elijah considered this, then nodded slowly. I understand secrets. He hefted the cookie tin. Want one? Miss. Beatrice helped us make them for the hospital staff. The unexpected offer caught Mason off guard. When was the last time someone had simply offered him a cookie with no agenda or expectation? He found himself accepting one, the simple sweetness of the sugar cookie transporting him momentarily to a Christmas long ago, when a kind hospital volunteer had brought treats to his bedside after his appendectomy. Thank you, he said, meaning more than just for the cookie. You're welcome, Elijah paused. I should go. Our van leaves soon? Mason nodded, but as the boy turned to leave, he found himself calling out, Elijah? Would you be interested in seeing how a hospital runs sometime? Perhaps a tour of the administrative side? The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise the boy. Mason hadn't planned them, hadn't run them through his usual mental filter for professional interactions. Elijah turned back, his eyes brightening with interest. For real? Like see your office and everything? If you'd like, after the holidays. That would be cool, Elijah said, a genuine smile transforming his serious face. Thanks, Mr. Reeves. As the boy walked away, Mason stood motionless in the corridor, wondering what had possessed him to extend such an invitation, and why it felt so right. The week between Christmas and New Year's passed in a blur of administrative catch-up for Mason and restless boredom for Elijah. Hillcrest was always at its most depressing during the holidays. Despite Ms. Beatrice's valiant efforts with donated decorations and special meals, most of the younger kids had been temporarily placed with foster families for the holidays, leaving the dormitories eerily quiet. Elijah spent the time reading books from the public library and thinking about the hospital CEO with the guarded eyes and unexpected connection to his past. When Mrs. Beatrice called him to her office on the first Monday after New Year's, he assumed he was in trouble for something, the default expectation for any summons at Hillcrest. There's someone here to see you, she said, her expression carefully neutral. In the visitor's room, Elijah's pulse quickened. No one ever came to see him. His last remaining relative, the aunt who had briefly taken him in after his parents' deaths, had made it clear she couldn't handle two children, especially after Sophie got sick. The visitor's room, rarely used except for potential foster parents meeting with younger children, felt unnaturally bright as Elijah entered. Mason Reeves stood by the window, looking out of place in his tailored suit amidst the shabby furniture. Mr. Reeves? Mason turned, offering a slight smile. Elijah, thank you for meeting with me. Did I have a choice? The words came out more bluntly than Elijah intended. Everyone has choices, Mason replied, surprising Elijah with his seriousness. Though some of us have fewer than others at certain points in our lives. Elijah sank into a chair across from where Mason stood. No. Why are you here? Is something wrong at the hospital? Nothing's wrong. I came to offer you that tour we discussed. If you're still interested. The unexpected follow-through caught Elijah off guard. Adults in his experience rarely remembered promises made to children, especially children with no power or influence. Today? Mason nodded. I've cleared it with Miss Beatrice. We can have lunch afterward if you'd like. Something about the careful way Mason extended the invitation told Elijah this wasn't a simple act of charity. The man seemed almost nervous. Okay, Elijah said, curiosity winning out over caution. Let me get my coat. The hospital looked different in daylight, less intimidating than it had during the evening toy distribution. Mason led Elijah through departments and offices, introducing him to staff with a formality that seemed to surprise them. Elijah absorbed everything with quiet intensity, asking occasional questions that made Mason look at him with growing appreciation. You have a good mind for systems, Mason observed as they exited the finance department. You understand how things connect. Elijah shrugged. I just pay attention. That's rarer than you might think. They ended in Mason's corner office, a space larger than the entire boys' dormitory at Hillcrest. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, gleaming under weak January sunshine. Elijah gravitated to the windows, mesmerized by the perspective. You can see everything from up here. Sometimes too much, Mason said quietly, coming to stand beside him. Sometimes not enough of what matters. Something in his tone made Elijah turn. The man's profile was etched against the bright window, revealing a weariness the boy hadn't noticed before. Did you always want to run a hospital? Elijah asked. Mason's lips curved slightly. No. When I was your age, I wanted to be a doctor. To help kids like me, who ended up in hospitals with no one to explain what was happening to them. What changed? Life. Circumstances. Mason turned from the window. I discovered I had talents better suited to administration than medicine. And from this position, I can help shape an entire institution, not just individual patients. Elijah nodded, understanding the logic, but sensing the hollow space beneath the words. Do you ever regret it? Not becoming a doctor? The directness of the question seemed to catch Mason off guard. He paused, considering his answer with a seriousness that respected Elijah's insight. Sometimes, he admitted, especially on days when I spend more time looking at spreadsheets than remembering why we're here. He gestured toward the hospital wing visible from the window. But then I see the results of what good administration can do. New wings built, better equipment purchased, more patients treated, and I know this was my path. My sister would have liked you, Elijah said suddenly. She always said you could tell good people by how they talked about their jobs. Mason's expression softened. Tell me about her. And somehow in that understated office high above the city, Elijah found himself talking about Sophie. Her laugh, her stubborn optimism, the way she had made up elaborate stories about the doctors and nurses to amuse herself during long treatment days. He spoke until his voice grew hoarse, releasing memories he had kept tightly bottled since her funeral. Mason listened without interruption, offering neither platitudes nor advice. When Elijah finally fell silent, Mason simply nodded and said, She sounds extraordinary. Like her brother. The simple acknowledgement loosened something in Elijah's chest that had been wound tight for months. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace. As they walked to a nearby restaurant for lunch, a light snow began to fall. Elijah tilted his face upward, letting the flakes melt against his skin. Sophie loved snow, he said. She said it made the world quiet enough to hear angels. Mason didn't respond immediately, but when he did, his voice carried an unfamiliar roughness. My mother used to say something similar. It was the first personal detail he had volunteered all day. The hospital tour became a monthly occurrence. Mason would arrive at Hillcrest on the first Saturday of each month, and Elijah would spend the day shadowing him through various hospital departments. Sometimes they would have lunch in Mason's office. Other times they would venture to nearby restaurants. Ms. Beatrice observed the growing connection with cautious optimism. He's different when he comes back from those visits, she told her assistant one evening. More present, like he's starting to believe in possibilities again. By spring, their routine had expanded. Mason began bringing books he thought Elijah might enjoy. Not children's books, but challenging works on medicine, hospital administration, even philosophy. Elijah devoured them all, arriving each month with thoughtful questions that increasingly impressed Mason. For his part, Mason found himself looking forward to these Saturdays with an anticipation that surprised him. The boy's perspective, untainted by corporate politics or professional compromise, reminded him of purposes he had gradually lost sight of during his climb to success. In May, as they walked through the newly renovated pediatric wing, Mason brought up a subject they had both carefully avoided. Have there been any inquiries about foster placement for you? Elijah's shoulders tensed slightly. No, not since last year. Do you still hope for that? A shrug. I'm almost 12. The chances get lower every year, especially for boys. The matter-of-fact tone carried no self-pity, just pragmatic assessment. It's okay. Hillcrest isn't so bad. Better than some places. Mason nodded, knowing all too well the statistics and realities. What about your plans after Hillcrest? Come on, a college, if I can get scholarships. Elijah glanced sideways at Mason. I've been thinking about medicine, or maybe hospital administration. The words hung between them, weighted with unspoken significance. Mason cleared his throat. Both worthy pursuits. You have the mind for either. They continued their tour, but something had shifted in the atmosphere between them. A possibility neither had acknowledged was taking tentative shape. Summer brought a heat wave that rendered Hillcrest's unair-conditioned dormitories nearly uninhabitable. When Mason arrived for their July visit, he found Elijah lethargic and flushed. Perhaps we should reschedule, he suggested, concern evident in his voice. I'm fine, Elijah insisted, though he swayed slightly as he stood. Just didn't sleep great. Too hot, Mason frowned. When was the last time you had a proper meal? In air conditioning? Elijah's hesitation was answer enough. Without further discussion, Mason steered him toward his car. We're going to my home for lunch, he said firmly. You need to cool down and eat something substantial. Elijah was too heat-exhausted to argue. The blast of air conditioning in Mason's luxury sedan made him sigh with relief, and he fell into a light doze during the drive to an upscale neighborhood he had only seen in movies. Mason's penthouse apartment was everything Elijah had imagined a rich person's home would be. Spacious, tastefully decorated, with views that made the ones from the hospital office seem ordinary by comparison. But what struck him most was how unlived in it felt. No photos on the walls, no books left open on tables, no sign that this was anything more than a very expensive hotel suite. Have a seat, Mason said, gesturing to the dining table while he moved efficiently around the kitchen, preparing sandwiches and cutting up fruit. There's water and lemonade in the refrigerator. Elijah sank gratefully into a chair that probably cost more than everything he owned. The cool air and quiet of the apartment gradually restored his energy, allowing curiosity to resurface. How long have you lived here? He asked as Mason set a plate before him. About 5 years, Mason replied, taking the seat across from him. After my divorce was finalized. This was new information. In all their conversations, Mason had never mentioned a marriage. You were married? A shadow crossed Mason's face. Briefly, it wasn't successful. Elijah sensed the closed door in the conversation and redirected. This place is nice. Really fancy. It serves its purpose, Mason said with a shrug that seemed to dismiss the luxury surrounding them. Though I'm rarely here except to sleep. They ate in companionable silence for a while. When Elijah had finished his sandwich and was working on a second helping of fruit, Mason spoke again. I've been thinking about something, Elijah. I'd like your opinion. The formal tone made Elijah sit up straighter. Okay. The hospital board has been discussing a new program, a scholarship and mentorship initiative for children who have experienced healthcare challenges, either personally or through family members. The idea would be to create a pathway for these children to eventually enter healthcare professions if they choose. Elijah nodded slowly. Like doctors and nurses who really understand what patients go through because they've been there? Exactly. Or administrators who understand healthcare from the patient perspective. I believe it could transform our hospital culture over time. That sounds amazing, Elijah said, his eyes brightening. Is it really happening? It's in the proposal stage, Mason said carefully. I wanted to discuss it with someone who might have valuable insight before presenting it to the full board. The implication that Mason valued his opinion enough to seek it on a major hospital initiative filled Elijah with a warm glow that had nothing to do with the summer heat. I think it's a great idea, he said earnestly. Kids like me, like I was when Sophie was sick, we see things differently. We know what matters in a hospital beyond just the medicine. Mason nodded, something like pride flickering in his eyes. That's precisely what I hoped you'd say. As the afternoon progressed, they moved to Mason's balcony, where a gentle breeze made the heat bearable. Their conversation shifted from hospital programs to books, movies, even Elijah's tentative interest in chess, which lit a surprising enthusiasm in Mason. I played competitively in college, he admitted, disappearing briefly into the apartment and returning with a handsome wooden chess set. What's one of would you like to learn? Time slipped away as Mason patiently taught Elijah the fundamentals. The boy proved a quick study, his strategic mind adapting readily to the game's complexities. When mirrors, Beatrice called to check on Elijah's whereabouts. Both were startled to discover the afternoon had turned to evening. "I should take you back," Mason said reluctantly. Elijah nodded, equally disappointed. As they packed up the chess pieces, he hesitated, then asked the question that had been building all afternoon. "Mr. Reeves, was the scholarship program your idea because of me?" Mason's hands stilled on the chessboard. "The concept has been discussed for some time," he said carefully. "But yes, getting to know you certainly influenced my interest in advancing it now. And could I maybe be part of it someday?" The hope in the boy's voice made Mason look up, meeting his gaze directly. "Elijah, you were the prototype I had in mind when drafting the proposal. If this program becomes reality, you would be an ideal candidate." The smile that spread across Elijah's face was like sunrise breaking through clouds. On the drive back to Hillcrest, a comfortable silence settled between them. As they pulled up to the orphanage's worn entrance, Mason made a decision. "Would you be interested in spending more time at my apartment occasionally? When the heat is unbearable here, we could continue your chess lessons." Elijah's eyes widened. "That would be awesome. But would Mrs. Beatrice allow it?" "Leave Miss Beatrice to me," Mason said with unexpected confidence. "I believe we can come to an arrangement." By August, Elijah was spending every other Saturday at Mason's penthouse. The chess lessons continued, but they were supplemented with trips to museums, bookstores, and once to a medical technology convention that left Elijah buzzing with excitement for days afterward. At Hillcrest, the other boys noticed the changes in him. New clothes that appeared mysteriously in his cubby, books that weren't from the public library, a growing confidence in his bearing. "You got yourself a rich sponsor or something?" 13-year-old Terrell asked one evening, half envious, half suspicious. "He's a mentor," Elijah replied carefully. From the hospital. The word mentor felt inadequate for whatever was growing between him and Mason, but he had no better term. Foster parent? Too presumptuous. Friend? Too casual for the formal CEO. Benefactor? Too cold for the man who had patiently taught him to make proper scrambled eggs in a sun-drenched kitchen, laughing at Elijah's initial heavy-handedness with pepper. What Elijah couldn't articulate, even to himself, was the fragile hope taking root in his heart. Hope that somehow this unexpected connection might lead to something permanent. Mason, too, found himself in unfamiliar emotional territory. His carefully structured life, built around work and more work, had expanded to include considerations he'd never anticipated. Did Elijah have adequate school supplies for the coming year? Was Hillcrest providing proper nutrition during the summer months when school meals weren't available? Would the boy enjoy the biography of pioneering surgeon Vivian Thomas that Mason had spotted in a bookshop window? These thoughts occupied spaces in his mind previously reserved for hospital budgets and strategic planning. More disconcerting were the moments when he caught himself imagining a future with Elijah as a permanent presence in his life. The scholarship program proposal moved through hospital committees with unusual speed, championed by board members impressed with Mason's unexpected passion for the initiative. By September, it had received preliminary approval, with funding to begin in the next fiscal quarter. "We need to celebrate," Mason told Elijah during their Saturday chess match. "This program will change lives for generations." Elijah captured Mason's night with a well-executed fork. "Including mine? Especially yours," Mason confirmed. "In fact, I've been thinking about your situation more broadly." Elijah looked up from the board, his expression guarded yet hopeful. "The program doesn't begin officially until January," Mason continued, his normally confident voice hesitant. "But your circumstances at Hillcrest, the inadequate heating, the limited academic resources, they concern me." "It's not so bad," Elijah said automatically, the defensive response of a child long accustomed to institutional care. "Perhaps not compared to some alternatives," Mason acknowledged, "but you deserve better. You have extraordinary potential, Elijah." The boy ducked his head, uncomfortable with the praise but visibly pleased. "Thanks." Mason took a deep breath. "I've been speaking with Miss Beatrice and with Family Services about the possibility of becoming your foster parent." The chess piece in Elijah's hand clattered to the board. "What? It would be a significant adjustment for both of us," Mason continued, his words measured but his eyes betraying his nervousness. "I've never raised a child. My work hours are demanding, but I believe we could make it work if you're interested." Elijah stared at him, searching for any sign that this was some cruel joke or misunderstanding. Finding none, he managed a single word. "Why?" The simplicity of the question seemed to catch Mason off guard. He leaned back in his chair, gaze drifting toward the window where late summer light gilded the city skyline. When I was 12, just after my mother died, I spent 3 months in a hospital with rheumatic fever, he said quietly. No visitors, no toys, nothing but pain and boredom and institutional indifference. A doctor there, Dr. Chen, noticed. He brought me books, explained my treatment in terms I could understand, treated me like a person instead of a case number. Mason's eyes refocused on Elijah. He saved more than my physical health. He gave me a vision of who I could become. After I recovered, he recommended me for a scholarship program that eventually led to college. He paused. I've never forgotten that debt. So this is about paying him back? Elijah asked, a hint of disappointment creeping into his voice. No, Mason said firmly. It's about recognizing that sometimes lives intersect for reasons beyond coincidence. When I saw that flyer for your toy drive, I could have walked past. I almost did, but something made me stop. The same something that has made these past months some of the most meaningful of my adult life. He leaned forward, his expression more open than Elijah had ever seen it. I'm not looking to replace your family, Elijah. Nothing can do that, but I am offering you a home if you want it. A chance for both of us to be less alone. Elijah sat very still, the chess game forgotten between them. The enormity of what Mason was proposing washed over him in waves. Freedom from Hillcrest, a stable home, educational opportunities beyond his wildest dreams. And beneath all that, the thing he had stopped allowing himself to hope for. Someone who had chosen him, specifically him. Can I think about it? He finally asked, his voice barely audible. Of course, Mason replied, disappointment flashing briefly across his face before he masked it. Take all the time you need. Elijah did think about it, constantly, obsessively over the following week. The prospect of leaving Hillcrest for Mason's penthouse was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying. What if it didn't work out? What if Mason regretted his decision once they were living together full-time? What if Elijah himself couldn't adjust to such a dramatic change? He confided in Ms. Beatrice, who listened with the patient wisdom born from decades of guiding children through life's hardest transitions. He seemed sincere, she said cautiously, and his background checks were impeccable. But only you can decide if this feels right for you, Elijah. On Friday afternoon, as Elijah sat on the worn steps of Hillcrest's side entrance, turning the question over in his mind for the 100th time, Darnell plopped down beside him. You're thinking too hard, the younger boy said matter-of-factly. Your brain's gonna explode. Despite himself, Elijah smiled. Yeah, probably. Just go live with the rich guy, Darnell continued, pulling a half-crushed candy bar from his pocket and breaking it in two to share. Worst case, you get a few months in a fancy apartment with good food before they send you back here. Elijah accepted the slightly melted chocolate. It's not that simple. Sure it is. You're just scared. I'm not scared. Elijah protested automatically. Darnell gave him a look of profound disbelief. Everyone's scared of good things happening. 'Cause if good things can happen, then you gotta hope. And hope hurts worse than anything when it gets smashed. The simple wisdom from the mouth of a 9-year-old hit Elijah with unexpected force. Darnell was right. He was afraid to hope. Afraid to believe that after everything, losing his parents, losing Sophie, being rejected by his only living relative, something genuinely good could enter his life. When did you get so smart? He asked Darnell. The younger boy grinned, chocolate smeared on his teeth. I've always been smart. You just never noticed because you're too busy being sad all the time. Elijah shoved him playfully, but the words lingered. Had he been so consumed by grief and survival that he'd been missing the wisdom all around him? What else might he be missing by refusing to open himself to new possibilities? That night, he wrote a letter to Sophie, something he had done regularly since her death, a private ritual that helped him process his thoughts. He told her about Mason, about the foster care offer, about his fears and hopes. As he wrote, clarity gradually emerged from his jumbled emotions. I think Mom and Dad would want me to be brave, he concluded, and I think you'd tell me to stop being a dummy and take a chance on being happy again. So I'm going to try, Soph. I'll never stop missing you, but I think it's time to start building something new. The next morning, when Mason arrived for their regular Saturday visit, Elijah was waiting on the front steps with his backpack. I've been thinking, he said before Mason could even greet him, about your offer. Mason's expression remained carefully neutral. And I'd like to try. The foster thing. If you still want to, The smile that transformed Mason's usually reserved face told Elijah everything he needed to know about the sincerity of the offer. "I still want to," Mason said simply. The transition was not without challenges. Paperwork and home studies took weeks to complete. Elijah's first night in the penthouse was a study in contrasts, the softest bed he'd ever slept in, yet the strangest and most sleepless night as city sounds replaced the familiar snores and creaks of the dormitory. Mason, too, found the adjustments substantial. His carefully ordered routines expanded to include school drop-offs, dinner conversations, and the novel experience of having another person's needs and schedule intertwined with his own. There were missteps. Mason's initial overcorrection toward material generosity, offering to replace all of Elijah's possessions with new ones, met with unexpected resistance from the boy. "I don't need new everything," Elijah insisted during their first weekend shopping trip. "Some of my stuff matters to me because it's mine, because I've had it through everything." Mason, recalling his own fierce attachment to the few possessions that had followed him through foster placements, immediately understood. "Of course, I apologize for assuming." Over time, they established rhythms and boundaries. Mason learned that Elijah needed space after school to decompress before discussing his day. Elijah discovered that Mason's occasional distraction wasn't personal, just the weight of hospital responsibilities that sometimes followed him home. Most importantly, they learned to talk through misunderstandings instead of retreating into defensive silence, a skill neither had mastered in their previous lives. By Thanksgiving, the penthouse had transformed. Books spilled from shelves, a science project occupied one end of the dining table, and framed photographs appeared on walls and side tables, including, in pride of place on the mantel, a school portrait of Sophie that Elijah had kept folded in his wallet. "She's part of our family story now, too," Mason had said when presenting the framed photo to Elijah, who had been unable to speak through the knot in his throat. The word family hung between them, tentative but growing stronger with each passing week. December brought the first anniversary of the toy drive that had brought them together. Mason, with Elijah's enthusiastic partnership, expanded the initiative hospital-wide, encouraging every department to participate. "We've received more donations than we have patients," the volunteer coordinator reported with delighted bewilderment. "What should we do with the excess?" "Distribute them to other hospitals," Mason decided, glancing at Elijah for confirmation. "Starting with the community hospitals in underserved areas." The day of distribution, Mason took a rare full day away from administrative duties to help Elijah coordinate the volunteer teams. Together, they visited every floor, from oncology to the neonatal unit, ensuring each patient received a personally selected gift. In the pediatric wing, they encountered Lily, now in remission and visiting for a routine checkup. "Elijah," she exclaimed, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "And Mr. Reeves, are you doing the toy thing again?" "We are," Elijah confirmed, gesturing to the laden cart beside them. "Want to help? You'd be an expert at knowing what kids might like." Lily's enthusiastic participation turned into an impromptu reunion as other former patients recognized Elijah from the previous year's distribution. By afternoon, a small army of current and former patients had joined the volunteer effort, creating a joyful chaos that drew smiles even from the most stressed hospital staff. As Mason watched Elijah guide a young volunteer through the process of matching toys to patient preferences, a strange tightness gathered in his chest. The boy he had first noticed almost exactly a year ago, serious, determined, weighted with grief, had blossomed into something extraordinary. Still serious when the situation called for it, still determined, but now animated by a confidence and joy that transformed his whole being. "I did that," Mason thought with a surge of unfamiliar pride. "Or at least I helped create the conditions for that transformation. And wasn't that what parenthood was, ultimately? Not shaping a child into a predetermined mold, but providing the safety and support for them to grow into their truest selves?" Later that evening, as they shared hot chocolate in the hospital cafeteria after the last toys had been distributed, Mason broached a subject that had been on his mind for weeks. "Elijah, the foster arrangement has been working well, I believe. For both of us." Elijah nodded, licking whipped cream from his upper lip. "Really well. I've been wondering if you might be interested in making it more permanent." The boy's hand stilled around his mug. You mean adoption?" "Yes." Mason met his gaze steadily. "It's entirely your decision, and there's no rush. But I wanted you to know it's something I would very much like to pursue, if you're open to it." Elijah sat very still, processing. "Would my name change?" "Only if you wanted it to." These decisions would be yours to make. Would I still be able to keep Sophie's things? And talk about her? And my parents? Of course, Mason said firmly. Adoption doesn't erase your past. It just secures your future. Elijah nodded slowly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I need to think about it. Not because I don't want to, but because it's big. Take all the time you need, Mason assured him, reaching across the table to squeeze his shoulder gently. Whatever you decide, know that you have a home with me for as long as you want it. The new year arrived with a snowstorm that blanketed the city in pristine white. From the penthouse windows, Elijah watched the transformation of the urban landscape, thinking about transformations of other kinds. The past year had reshaped his life in ways he could never have imagined when posting those first toy drive flyers. He had gone from an orphan with dwindling hope to a boy with prospects, a challenging new school, a stable home, and most importantly, an adult who cared deeply about his well-being. Mason had changed too. The reserved, work-obsessed CEO had gradually softened, making space in his life for school events, weekend adventures, and long conversations about everything from hospital ethics to the best strategy for conquering Elijah's increasingly difficult video games. Their relationship had evolved into something neither had quite expected. Not exactly father and son in the traditional sense, but a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. On a quiet Sunday morning, as they worked together preparing breakfast, Elijah on toast duty, Mason handling the eggs, Elijah made his decision. I've been thinking about what you asked. About adoption, Mason's hands paused briefly before continuing their work. And I'd like that, to be adopted. By you. Mason set down the spatula and turned to face him fully, emotion transparent on his usually composed face. You're sure? Elijah nodded. I'm sure, but I have a condition. What's that? I want to keep my last name, Parker, as my middle name, to remember where I came from. Elijah Parker Reeves, Mason said softly, testing the sound of it. It has a distinguished ring to it. And one more thing, Elijah added, a slight tremor in his voice. I want to start a foundation in Sophie's name for siblings of sick kids. They get forgotten sometimes, but they need help too. Mason's eyes glistened with unexpected moisture. That's an excellent idea. We can begin planning it immediately. The toast popped up, momentarily diverting their attention. As Elijah buttered the slices, he felt Mason's hand come to rest lightly on his shoulder. A simple gesture that conveyed everything words could not. The adoption was finalized in spring, as cherry blossoms dusted the city with pale pink snow. The courtroom ceremony was brief but meaningful, attended by a small gathering that included Ms. Beatrice Darnell, who had appointed himself Elijah's best friend and therefore essential to all major life events, several hospital colleagues who had become friends to them both, and surprisingly, Lily and her parents. As the judge pronounced the adoption complete, Mason and Elijah exchanged glances filled with a quiet wonder at the journey that had brought them to this moment. At the small celebration afterward, held in a private room at Elijah's favorite restaurant, Ms. Beatrice approached Mason with a knowing smile. When you first showed up asking about Elijah, I had my doubts, she admitted. I've seen too many well-intentioned people discover that taking on a child's pain is harder than they expected. Mason nodded, a reasonable concern. But watching you two together, she shook her head, smiling. It's like you were always meant to find each other. Some matches are just written in the stars, I suppose. Later, as father and son walked home through the park, Elijah broached a question that had been lingering in his mind. Do you believe in fate? That some things are meant to happen? Mason considered this thoughtfully. I've always been more inclined toward believing we make our own destiny through our choices. But what about coincidences? Like you being at the community center that night, seeing my flyer? Perhaps not coincidence, Mason acknowledged. Perhaps recognition. One soul recognizing another that has walked a similar path. Elijah nodded, satisfied with this explanation. Like how you recognized something in me, and I recognized something in you, even before we knew each other's stories. Exactly like that. They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Elijah spoke again. I'm glad you stopped to read my flyer. Mason's hand came to rest gently on Elijah's shoulder. So am I. It may have been the most important pause I've ever taken. As they continued toward home, a word that finally meant something real and lasting to both of them, the evening sky deepened to indigo above the city lights. Behind them, the path they had walked stretched back toward the hospital, where an orphan's simple act of kindness had set in motion a transformation neither could have imagined. Ahead lay a future they would build together, step by step, choice by choice, day by day. Two lives, once defined by what they had lost, now redefined by what they had found in each other.